Good. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this ComPeer event, Regulation and Investment Change, the Client View. My name is Henry Algio. Earlier this year, I stood down as Group Managing Director and COO at Brewin Dolphin. So as regards the effort and expense of preparing for and rolling out RDR and the changing regimes, to coin a phrase, I feel your pain. Although I have to say, now that I've stood down, I don't feel it quite so keenly. Within your own organisations, you all know what it has cost financially and what changes have been required. The various trade bodies have worked very hard with their members and with the FSA and then FCA to help get things moved along. And I'm sure we all have our own view of what our clients think. However, ComPeer and EY have taken the initiative to do some research and get some hard facts and produce some analysis for us on what the impact really is on clients. Today's sessions are about presenting that research, getting views on it from a broad spectrum of commentators, practitioners, and others. We look forward to 2 lively panel sessions, and that's an opportunity for you to engage and to have an exchange of views, and I'm relying on you to ask some hard questions. We have some very distinguished speakers, and I'm glad to say that they have all agreed to take questions after their talks. So again, line up your questions. A couple of housekeeping issues. If you hear the fire alarm, please evacuate the room immediately. Do not wait to collect personal belongings. Evacuate via the nearest fire exit and assemble in front of the Dolphin Fountain by the river. It'll be very picturesque, but I hope we don't have to use it. Now, again, please put your mobile phones to silent or turn them off. Thank you. Time's precious. We have a full agenda, so let's move right on. Our first speaker is Nick Poyntz-Wright, Director of Long-Term Saving and Pensions at FCA. To hear the view from inside the North Colonnade at Canary Wharf is something that we all value. So we're very grateful to Nick for being with us today, and also we're very grateful to him for agreeing to take questions at the end of his talk. Nick, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Henry, and I really am grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk to so many of you today. As Henry explained, I'm actually quite keen to hear your questions and your comments. Increasingly, within the conduct regulation space, it's important for us to understand what's going on out in the marketplace, what concerns and issues practitioners are having. And so really important to me to establish a constructive dialogue about how we take things forward. Our focus is on trying to improve outcomes for clients, however those outcomes are delivered, and to try to make sure they're delivered safely and meeting the client's expectations. As you will probably know, and I know many of you operate within the wealth management area, that's a key focus for the Financial Conduct Authority now. We have decided that it's important to look particularly at that sector. I don't mean that in a threatening way. I think we're interested and we're conscious that perhaps we haven't given it all the attention that it may deserve under the FSA. And so we have established a new department within my area of the organisation, and we're starting to consider what the most important priorities are in that area. So again, a good reason to hear from you in terms of what you're seeing and the concerns that you may have. As Henry explained, very happy to take questions, but I'm going to reflect during my talk on some of the major developments in the regulatory sphere over the past year or so, and also to touch on some that may be coming up in the near future. The first obvious change over the last year is that I speak to you today as a representative of the FCA. Over the last 9 months, you will have heard and read a lot about how the new regulator will work, and some of you may have experienced our operating style at first hand. I hope you've begun to see some changes for the better in the way that we regulate the sector, but that's certainly our aim. We're particularly keen as a new regulator to become more forward-looking, to begin to preempt some of the issues and problems before they magnify, making use of all the information that's available to us, including market research. And of course, today you're going to hear later about ComPeer's end investor research, the highlights of which I believe James is going to be talking to you about a bit later on. Now, research such as this brings insights into the behaviour of consumers, of clients. That could be when to invest, how to invest, or what they expect to receive from their product or from their advisor. This sort of research aligns very closely to what the FCA is interested in. Wherever possible, we're going to be considering issues and outcomes from the consumer's perspective. Another area you may have heard us talk about is behavioural economics. And this tells us that the FSA's historic reliance on disclosure is unlikely to be fully effective on its own. I'm sure you as well as I can relate to this, but confronted by more and more paperwork, consumers will often tend to withdraw and switch off rather than engaging with the new information to understand what it means to them. So I would encourage you to draw on all the feedback you can from your customers and consumers more generally to help you design and target your products and services more effectively. So new regulator aside, undeniably the biggest regulatory changes for many firms this year has been, as Henry said, the implementation of the Retail Distribution Review. After many years of speculation about how the industry would react, it's still too early to measure the full impact it has had. And more will come on this once we conduct our post-implementation review of the RDR in 2014. However, I do want to highlight some of the developments we've seen to date and identify some of our early concerns. The first thing to highlight is that we haven't seen the dramatic reduction in advisor numbers that some people were forecasting in the run-up to RDR. The latest figures suggest that just under 33,000 advisors are out there, up 5% since the start of the year. So there's actually been an increase since the turn of the year. And the vast majority of those have successfully achieved the new benchmark qualifications. We've observed a shift in some advisory firms' target market towards wealthier clients and an exodus of firms catering for the mass market. So there has been a shift in terms of the areas that are being served. There's also been an increase in joint ventures and strategic partnerships. And we've seen the development of new non-traditional advice models and an increase in execution-only and non-advised sales. So these are all some of the things that we, and I'm sure you, have been observing. As I say, it's still relatively early days, and the full impact of the RDR will take a lot longer to fully emerge. As a result, these initial developments that we're seeing are probably just reflecting a transitional stage. However, there are already a number of issues that we've identified and begun to take action on. The first, which has been quite widely commented on in the media, is the emergence of a so-called advice gap. So we do understand the potential for such a gap, and we do hear a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we've yet to conclude ourselves that the RDR has had a significant impact on the number of people seeking advice, or that it has forced out those with less money to invest. But we do see this as a potential area and an issue, so we continue to monitor it, and you can expect to hear some more from us in the new year on this particular topic. On the subject of joint ventures and strategic relationships, you may be aware of the report that we produced in September, which looked into whether advisory firms continued to be influenced by payments from product providers, which, whilst not strictly commission, may have a similar effect. This review of 26 firms found that some payments by product providers to advisory firms did appear to be linked to securing sales of their products. So in summary, we found that there were financial arrangements in place with product providers that may have incentivized advisory firms to promote a specific provider's product to their advisors, with the risk that their advice could be influenced more by commercial decisions than by the interests of their customers. We also looked at joint ventures. So we saw one particular example where an advisory firm was paid a substantial upfront fee by the provider, with its profits, the advisory firm's profits, increasing the more it channeled its business into the joint venture. So this was where, for example, a new investment proposition might be jointly developed by a provider and an advisory firm. And so again, there could be potential for conflicts of interest and possibly biased advice. I'm not suggesting that these cases are the norm, but fundamentally the findings do lead us to question the degree to which some firms are effectively identifying and managing conflicts of interest. This is directly captured in Principle 8 of our key principles for business. And if we feel there is a lack of sufficient attention to conflicts, you should certainly expect a robust response. Now, I'm pleased to report that most of the firms who were involved in that review have already made changes to their arrangements, but we do want all firms in the market to consider and, if necessary, make changes to their existing arrangements. You'll see our response to the consultation in the new year, and we'll consider revisiting the area in future to check that the necessary improvements have been made. The final RDR-related issue that I wanted to highlight today is actually related to the increase in non-advised sales. So as part of the FCA's new approach, we want to take an early look at the new distribution models which are emerging to ensure that clients are getting the right outcomes and, if necessary, provide clarification for firms. To do this, we're conducting a thematic review to assess market practice, to assess the new models as they emerge, and to identify examples of good and poor practice. We intend to conduct assessments of a sample of firms from different sectors and with a different range of business models. What we want to see is that firms' non-advised or simplified advice models have been developed to meet the needs of their target market, and that firms help their customers purchase products which are appropriate for their needs and objectives. A considerable percentage of retail business nowadays is written on investment platforms. The platforms agenda started in 2007 alongside the RDR policy development, and since then the FSA and subsequently the FCA has conducted extensive consultation in the area of platforms, which has culminated in the policy statement published in April this year. The policy statement was long awaited, but I think as a result of the extensive consultation, I don't think you could say that it contained too many surprises when it arrived. So the rules that we're introducing, which come in next April, are largely the ones that we consulted on, with the benefit of research that we undertook into business models, into competition, and consumer understanding of platforms. The aims of these rules really are threefold. The first is to remove the risk of the retained rebate model being used by providers to influence platforms' inclusion and presentation of their products. The second was just to increase transparency, improve the distinction between the platform, the product, and the advisor charges. And finally, we're hoping that it should enhance competition, so the price of platform services is more effectively revealed, and the choice of funds and products that are available to customers should expand rather than contract. What we've seen so far in response is the emergence of clean and super clean share classes, although we will be keeping a close eye on the overall cost to the customer. I would also draw your attention to the guidance consultation, which has been issued quite recently, relating to the bulk transfer of clients, and you should consider how that might impact upon your customers. So I've talked so far about ongoing work or developments that have come through in the recent period, but I also would like to mention a couple of areas that remain on our radar and may interest you. Firstly, we're increasingly interested in developments in the pensions market. As you would expect, we're working closely with other stakeholders on topics such as pensions liberation and auto-enrolment. And we have ongoing work looking at SIPs and the annuities market. You can expect to see some more on some of these topics in 2014. In the wealth management and private banking area, we're conscious of the potential for conflicts of interest where firms are recommending investment by private clients into their own in-house funds. And it's possible we may look at this more closely in 2014 to ensure that firms are managing these conflicts adequately and making sure they deliver the right outcomes to their clients. So in concluding, and hopefully leaving some time for your questions, it's fair to say the last year has presented many challenges for firms operating in the sector, and I'm afraid there's no immediate let-up in sight. Nonetheless, we at the FCA see these developments as important interventions to improve standards across the industry and encourage consumers to rediscover the trust they used to have in financial services. And we shouldn't forget the international comparisons which will be made in terms of the relative strength and quality of the UK and notably London as a financial centre. Restoration of trust and confidence amongst consumers and the wider international community is something I'm sure we can all align behind. So I'm looking forward to working with you to make it a reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you very much indeed. And you've left plenty of time for questions. We've got nearly 20 minutes. So who wants to ask the first question? Right, can you put your hand up, and then we've got a roving mic. Can you say who you are and then ask Nick your question? Go ahead.
Hi, Alison Moulton. I just wondered if I could hear your view on the role of super clean share classes and how they fit with sort of overall objectives at RDR and transparency.
Okay, thank you. So this is obviously the development that's coming through. So the first element is the clean share class, which, if you like, gives a factory gate price, and super clean is then at sort of a level below that. I think one of our new objectives, which I didn't touch on at any great length, is competition. So we are keen to see that competition flourishes within the market in order to deliver the better outcomes for clients. One of the things we'll be monitoring, and I referred to the total cost to the client, is to make sure that where there are very good terms negotiated as a result of perhaps the bargaining power, whether it be of the advisory firm, the platform and so on, is that actually wherever possible those outcomes come to the benefit of the client. and don't get stuck higher up the value chain. And I think in some ways what we would hope is that the greater transparency in terms of the costs at each stage in the chain should hopefully allow that competitive dynamic to flow down to the client. But we're mindful of the potential risks, and also mindful of the fact that a plethora of information about all sorts of different costs and charges down the chain can be confusing. So we will be looking at that. Thank you.
Next question.
Keith Richards. Nick, you mentioned that we've got to regain the trust that the industry once had in the past. What is the FCA's view or your view on the reasons why we don't have as much consumer trust today?
That's quite a short question, but capable of a very long answer. I mean, I think the environment that we've been operating in over the last period of time, has put a lot of stresses on the sorts of savings and investment products, but also other types of financial products which have been made available to the end consumer. So I think some of that is down to the economic cycle and more global factors in terms of all the things that cause that. But quite a lot of it is down to the behaviour of firms serially over the years, and even stretching back decades in the marketplace. And again, I haven't been a regulator for so long. I was in the private sector myself, so I don't say that in an accusatory way. But the fact is there have been a series of mis-selling events and scandals which have mushroomed into very significant events and have cost an enormous amount for the industry and indeed for government and regulators to mop up. And I think one of the consequences of those events being allowed to grow to such a size and serially over time has been that many, many people have been affected by them. So it is a long road back. I don't think we should be under any illusions. But I do think that it's very much a worthy journey. It's something that we should be moving towards. I do sense a renewed enthusiasm for that and a determination to get there. But a lot of it, as I say, I think is part of it you can say is to do with the economic cycle and global events, but quite a lot of it at the end of the day is about the behaviour of participants in the market. And so a lot of what we're considering in the FCA is thinking about that behaviour, thinking about the practice of firms in the market. And at the heart of it, you get to culture. You get to the culture and the mindset of firms that operate within the financial services industry. And this is why we're trying to concentrate on helping, encouraging firms to do the right thing. And I can't overemphasize that. That's far more important if you're thinking from the client or customer's perspective and doing the right thing by them. That's far, far more important than the kind of tick box compliance that we might have concentrated on in the past.
Thank you. Gavin Oldham down here. Thank you, Gavin.
Gavin Oldham, the Share Centre. One of the fund research organisations is currently undertaking a survey on whether it's a good idea for national savings and investment products to be distributed through wealth managers. I wonder if you could say whether you think this is a welcome development, and if you do, could you perhaps suggest how you think that firms which do distribute them might be remunerated, particularly bearing in mind that they're sold directly at the moment by national savings and investments?
Okay, I haven't got a view to give on the specifics of that, I'm afraid, but with the help from colleagues, we might be able to address that more specifically subsequently, if that's okay. I mean, I think one of the principles is that, and I think RDR should facilitate that, and the new transparency should facilitate it, is actually to enable a wider selection and more choice to clients in terms of the different investments that are recommended and can be provided. I'm not sure about the specific issues in relation to national savings and investments, but I would have thought that if you're trying to concentrate on delivering the best possible outcome for the client, then obviously within the limitations of the range of products that you advise upon, you should be thinking about all of the possible ways of achieving that for them. So I don't want to comment on the specifics because I'm afraid I'm not prepared and briefed to do that, but we maybe can pick that up subsequently.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Next, at the back there, yep.
Thank you. Stuart Lee Davis from Redmayne Bentley. Nick, you talked about providing better client outcomes, but isn't it the case that with the exponential increase in the costs of compliance, ultimately the underlying client is going to have to pay for that? I wonder if you would agree with that, because the firms obviously can't keep sucking up costs forever. And having worked on the dark side, as it were, you know all about this. But also, isn't it the case, you mentioned that there's anecdotal evidence of an advice gap, but ultimately, the logic, if you follow it through, that we're going to get a polarized market where you're going to get big firms at one end, smaller firms perhaps, those who manage to survive at the other end, and yet what the law of unintended consequences is likely to be that the big funds will only be offering, the big houses will only be offering funds on a predetermined list. You're going to get a concentration of risk for the underlying client. The advice gap is going to get wider and wider. You say anecdotally, it must be there. You know, we read it in the paper all the time. And I wonder what your thoughts are as far as how these people are going to manage to retire. If the costs of compliance keep going up and up, it has to impact on returns. And the evidence is there to show that charges have a major impact on returns. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on those points I raised. A lot to go through, I admit. Sorry.
Well, that was a very full question, but thank you. I sort of, if I can, you might want to come in and correct me if I've missed anything, but there were sort of three particular parts to it. One is the cost of compliance. And I think certainly you're right, and I don't think it would be betraying too much of the research results. I think the research results talk to, you know, where do clients see the cost of compliance falling, and I think the answer is on them. And that is the fact. I suspect to a certain extent firms might be able to absorb elements of it. But I think that the significant changes that we've seen undoubtedly have led to cost. There's a process that we go through when there is significant regulatory change, which is to look at all the cost-benefit analysis and so on, which is actually quite a thorough process. So I know, I mean, just as an aside, many of you probably will have been asked from time to time in the consultation papers, we're going to change X, Y, and Z. So, you know, please give an estimate or some indication of how much it will cost you. It would certainly be very helpful. The more accurate those estimates are, you know, the more we can pin down the cost-benefit analysis. But that's a slight aside. I think to address the point, yes, we would acknowledge that ultimately the costs of compliance need to be incorporated. And therefore, if that cost is too great, then by definition, the charges will begin to eat too much into potential investment returns. I mean, there's another way of looking at it, which is to say, you know, if your business is set up in the right way to deliver good outcomes and to do the right thing by your customers, and that's the area that we're really going to focus on, then, you know, you could argue that to get the right quality of business, the right client loyalty over time, actually you're going to need to do those sorts of things anyway. I would accept that there's some extra, significant extra items which you're required to do, and I think we should look at that. The comments that I'm making on disclosure, for example, perhaps go to that. The next bit that you talked about was touching on the advice gap. You're right. I think there's a flow of logic which says that actually many advisory firms will recognise they need to move up market. And I think some of those that have withdrawn from what you might call the mass retail market have recognised that the cost of providing full advice, or certainly in the way in which they were providing it, was uneconomic. Many of the same institutions are still interested in that customer segment, but are thinking about approaching it in a different way. So I think a lot of that was around the model that they had and the inbuilt costs that it had. And actually, interestingly, the RDR perhaps caused more firms to really recognise the cost of their advisory businesses. So that doesn't change the fact that many have stepped back. So we have this particular point at the moment where, as you say, that there could be a gap in provision. And I'll say two things about that. One is that we're interested in seeing new models which are arriving, often with more use of technology, which we believe may begin to fill that gap. We also have auto-enrolment, which is rolling through at the moment, which will, by default, cause many of those in that customer segment to begin to save. I think arguably not enough to provide ultimately for their retirement, but to begin to save, which I think is a good thing. So the other thing I would say as well in terms of unintended consequences is that we are monitoring this. You know, RDR was 6 or 7 years in the making, and it's not all going to be over and done with in a year or two. It will take time to flow through, and there may well be tweaks of the tiller or adjustments that need to be made for the right reasons. The other thing is I think it was introduced more as a framework, to say here is a framework within which we would encourage firms to consider how they're going to adopt their business. There's still quite a lot of freedom in how you do that. And ideally, as I say, trying to find a way to deliver the right outcomes for clients, to do the right thing by their clients, more than just making sure that they're legally and compliantly just inside the boundaries of what's acceptable. I hope that helps. I'm not sure if I covered the full spectrum, but
I'm going to have to give somebody else an opportunity.
Give someone else an
somebody
opportunity.
down the other end of the room here. Sir.
Nick, Gary Dale, Investec Bank. Maybe following on from the last question about the advice gap. I would probably for the first time in my life find myself agreeing with the regulator in that I don't think there is an advice gap. I think there's a savings gap. It's always existed, but it's going to get worse. RDR, the unintended consequence of RDR, combined with the concurrent demise of the advice in inverted commas channel within banks and building societies, that's caused the gap. And we're talking about millions of consumers with less than 50k to invest. So perhaps maybe share your thoughts on the effect that's going to have long term. But tied in with that, I'd welcome your thoughts on the differences between, you talk about non-advised sales. There is a very distinct difference between execution only and direct to consumer. And I wonder if the regulator might help providers with more clarity around the requirements on the provider, because execution only, as you know, is a very different service to one where a customer wishes to purchase direct. So I'm just curious on your thoughts.
Okay, I mean, firstly, to pick up again briefly on the advice gap point, I sympathise with your comments, because I think at the end of the day, the gap is the gap between supply and demand. And I think to some extent, the issues that we're seeing are equally as much on the demand side. And some of that relates back to Keith's point on the trust and the confidence for clients to actually want to invest and to save. But I do take the point in terms of the potential consequences from RDR. I think the other point in terms of moving into the non-advice space, I absolutely accept that there is quite a broad spectrum of models which apply there. So execution only, as you say, very different to a more direct consumer offering, and equally, there are some models which emerge, particularly technology-based ones, where from a client's point of view, and just thinking about it from a client's point of view, they may quite often feel like they've been advised, even though perhaps strictly speaking the model is set up as a non-advised model. And how clear is it to the client that actually, although it might feel like they've been advised, there are certain things that in fact they haven't, or at least the limitations of the service that's been provided. So there is a spectrum, and I think we're now quite, what I was trying to indicate in my talk was that we're interested in that spectrum, and we're trying to assess the different types of models which apply within that space, to look at how they're operating at the moment. And it's not just about how they're operating at the moment, because I think that whole area is evolving quite fast. So it's also looking at how some firms are planning to address that market, or how they're developing. So this is exploratory work, and I think quite often the thematic reviews and work that we do is not necessarily with an assumption that actually there's something significantly wrong. Quite often we'll go and do some what we would call discovery work, just to gather intelligence and understand a bit more about what's happening. And this is an example of that. But we are interested to see what we'll find, and I think we do feel that certainly for the mass retail market, some of the solutions in terms of serving that market over time may well come from that area.
Thanks, Nick. I think we've time for one more short question. Down here at the end, yeah. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Chris Bosworth, Close Brothers. I was just wondering if we could get your views on Nest and how you think that will interface with the private sector.
We are interested in that. I mentioned auto-enrolment is an interest for us, and of course Nest has been established as a sort of default recipient of auto-enrolment schemes, and for many employers, I think particularly smaller ones, but for many employers actually it might be the provider of choice. But if nothing else, one of the concerns that we have is that there are certain staging points where employers of certain sizes are required to implement auto-enrolment, and naturally at that point we suspect, particularly when we get to the medium size and then the smaller employers, they may be looking and reacting at this rather too late in the day. That's the point where, if you like, Nest is there to catch and receive by default those employers that haven't made other arrangements. But we're working with them and also in conjunction with providers in the market and the pensions regulator to try to reinforce to practitioners in the market that we need to be talking to employers in particular on this and trying to get them to think about this as early as possible. So that's probably at the moment is focusing our minds on auto-enrolment, is this capacity issue. And so we are talking with Nest. I mean, they're taking very significant steps to plan all of this and monitoring the amount of business that's coming through. And, they will be in a position to be as robust as possible to receive potentially the deluge of employers that come to them. But this is a potential issue. So I think we work closely with them, but obviously we wait to see how that's actually going to play out.
Okay. Nick, thank you very much indeed. That's all we have time for, ladies and gentlemen, but thank you very much indeed for being so open and candid. And ladies and gentlemen, will you show your appreciation to Nick Poyntz-Wright, please?
Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Thanks very much. Okay, we're moving on now to our trade bodies session. So if our trade bodies could get onto the stage, we'll be able to make a start. Yeah. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, the trade bodies have been working on behalf of their respective constituencies, as I said earlier, to liaise with the regulator and help their members to work their way through RDR and the other regulatory changes that have been going on. We feel it might be helpful if we ask each of them in turn just to say, speak for a couple of minutes on what issues they've been coming across and how they see the state of the world at the minute. So I'm going to start by asking Tim May to kick off. Tim. Thank
you, Henry, and good morning to everybody. As we heard from Nick, and I'm sure all of us would agree, clients really are key, because without them, most of us wouldn't have a business, other than perhaps consultants who will help the firms try and find more clients. And a big thank you to ComPeer, not just for this event, but they provide certainly our community with vital statistics and gives us the real number of actually how many clients are working with wealth managers, which is somewhere around 4 million consumers in this country at the moment. And we as WMA are committed to ensuring that the members can always act in the best interests of those clients. And I think this came up in some of the questioning, regulation often plugs gaps, which sadly then just impacts the firms that are still in business and doesn't impact the ones that have probably gone and caused the problem in the first place. And it does come back to that fact that we are striving for client protection, but it's not always clear that proposed changes are actually always in the best interests of clients. We heard earlier that clients will usually, in these sort of businesses, be the ones who end up paying for changes. And as Nick mentioned, there are cost-benefit analyses, but I'm not sure they're sufficient. And just to give you two examples of situations recently where we're just not sure that the client has been thought about in parts of the regulatory structure. The cost, perhaps, of the impact may have been, but not the end client. And one is the PRIPS developments in the EU, which you may not be following, but more recently has been at least quite pragmatic and decided to remove equities from the scope. Sadly, it's left corporate bonds in, and for those that don't know, you cannot operate a real-time market in any of those instruments if the current PRIPS regulation comes through in the EU. Now, I can't believe that's in the best interest of all clients in every one of the 28 countries. So it's something we will battle on. The other one is the asset manager conflicts of interest. Certainly conflicts of interest are vital, and as Nick said, there's a lot of work being done on that. But sadly, there was no work done in the actual wealth management space. It was all done on asset managers and then read across to the wealth management industry, which causes a lot of time and effort for people to have to read these things without it actually having perhaps the direct applicability. So we would ask that we do have a little bit more, as Martin Wheatley said in a recent speech, alongside pragmatism, we need to be consultative, and we would really ask that for a sector such as wealth management, it does start to get recognised as a separate thing and we get more differentiated regulation. Just a second point I'd like to say this morning, so that's the regulatory one, is we are particularly, and you may have read this in the press, pushing for more access for investors into IPOs. There's been quite a lot of excitement and an enormous amount of interest in the Royal Mail situation, and you may have seen that we've now done a second survey with Peel Hunt on the results of the experience that we've all just gone through. And we believe, as part of what was discussed in some of the questions, of eventually building long-term savings opportunities for people. It is vital that if clients want to have access, there should be that access there, and it shouldn't just be through either institutions who go in the first phase or through the secondary market. So that is a second key point that we're pushing for.
Okay, thanks, Tim. That's great. Keith Phillips, BBA, could you give us a couple of minutes?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. We consider the private banking and wealth management industry to be effectively the jewel in the crown of the financial services industry, and as a consequence, and through the work of our new member sector advisory board, which is populated by the chief executives of many of the private banking groups, we're focusing currently on three things. The first is the economic value of the sector to the city and to the UK. We think that it's currently underplayed, and at the BBA and in collaboration with some of the other trade associations, and particularly with Tim's WMA, we want to drive greater recognition for the sector, both in government and key stakeholder groups. That also extends to the promotion of the sector to international markets. And in that respect, we think that the positive aspects of RDR, really that of higher professional standards and greater client centricity, gives the UK an edge, and gives the UK an edge particularly in relation to other financial centres. And then finally, the sort of third key area of focus is that we need to make sure that legislation and regulatory developments support the competitiveness of the sector and its ability to address client needs. We think that the creation in the FCA of its new department focusing on wealth is a significant development, and we are going to be working very closely with that department to manage the development of the industry. Thank you.
Thanks. Susan Wright from the IMA. Susan, could you give us yours?
We're probably coming to this from a slightly different place to many of you here, although some of the firms represented today will be IMA members. The things that we're really looking at have probably been mentioned already by the other two speakers. We are quite concerned about competitiveness of the UK, and probably we would like to see a little bit more joined up approach by the regulators. That includes FCA, Treasury, HMRC, all those different ones. There seems to be some very good initiatives that are put out there to encourage sort of long-term saving, things like child trust funds, junior ISAs, all these type of things. They're great big, promotion, they come out, and then they sort of fade away, and I'm not sure that really gives sort of the best message out there to the public. We talked a lot about sort of, or Nick talked rather, about, sort of improving transparency, more protection. There was talk about a savings gap, but I also think there's probably a bit of a knowledge gap. Because unless we can get the younger generations to actually start to understand what investment means, and actually there was research out yesterday that if you haven't started sort of looking at your pension by the age of 48, it's actually too late. It's not a great message to put out there. So we're working with a number of education and sort of training initiatives out there to try and push this into schools as well. And I suppose the final thing really is, on top of all these, is just that sheer amount of regulation. And I had to laugh actually, because you got invitations about a compliance tsunami. I mean, I've heard it called tsunami and wave and all sorts of different things. And the other sort of impact that leads to for firms, I think, is just really a lack of resource out there, which our members are telling us is trying to find, sort of the sort of actual staff to come in and sort of work with them.
Thank you, Susan. Chris Hannant, the Association of Professional Financial Advisors. Chris.
I think there are probably, to sort of sum it up, three broad areas of concern currently to our members. The first being regulation. I think there is a certain wariness about new regulation and what that entails, although some of the initial signs are quite welcome, and some of our members have commented on the more open and engaging stance from the FCA. But there is still the length of the handbook, the prospect of further tweaking, which was alluded to by Nick, of RDR rules when there's still a long way to go in seeing it all settle down. So there is uncertainty around regulation, and I think most of our members want some stability. Secondly, they're thinking about business development. There has been a lot of upheaval in the market, and some firms are looking at that to take opportunities. And looking to the future, people are also concerned about where the talent for tomorrow is coming from, how the sector will develop new advisors and where they will come from. And thirdly, I think it's been a couple of people who've mentioned this already this morning. Concern about the savings culture in this country, or the lack of savings culture in this country. How are the mass market to be encouraged to save, and where are the clients for tomorrow going to come from?
Okay, thanks, Chris. And finally, from the Personal Finance Society, Keith Richards. Keith.
Okay, good morning, everyone. A confession to start with. Personal Finance Society, a lot of heads looked up then. Personal Finance Society is not a trade body. We are a professional body. And I guess the easy way to distinguish the difference is that whilst we represent 34,000 individual members, around 24,000 of whom are qualified financial advisors, our role charter puts public interest at the heart of our objectives. So first and foremost, any engagement we have with the FCA is around improving better consumer outcomes. So I'm delighted to be at this conference today. You've already heard that the Armageddons previously predicted did not occur on the 31st of December last year. I'm delighted to say far more financial planners got through the deadline. But then, of course, many of the pessimists said, well, it's just a delayed reaction. Once consumers start to realise just how much they're going to have to pay for advice, we'll start to see quite a big exit in the first 6 months. That actually didn't occur. So they actually said it's just a delayed reaction. Advisors are living off their bank accounts, and it's all going to happen in the second half. One of the most widely predicted numbers is literally just 6 weeks away, and that's that by the end of this year we would be down to 20,000 qualified financial advisors. As you heard from Nick, at the half-year stage the number had actually increased to 32,690, and it's continued to increase and is just under the 33,000. We would say that that is testament to the quality of the individuals who remain. And actually, we would also say that for consumers who receive advice, it's a clear endorsement that they trust the people that they receive advice from. The unfortunate thing is that they probably don't trust the profession that the people that they receive advice from represents. The bigger challenge I think we face, in addition to the points that Chris has already made about the cost of regulation, the increasing risk, it's pleasing to hear Nick mention about the complexity of the process, which actually adds very little value to the end consumer. So it's really good to be working with a new regulator who genuinely is seeming to take a completely different approach to their predecessor. We would say that the challenge I think we have for the public is that there is a negative perception. Research has overwhelmingly demonstrated that. And we've got to work together collectively as an industry, as a profession, to overcome those challenges. It's not so much for those consumers who receive advice, it's actually for those who need advice but have never engaged. If you can't quantify it with some of the negative perceptions in the market, we are disserving the public. We have called together a consumer panel, challenging actually some of the consumer representative groups that they are perhaps putting a disproportionate and negative perception into the market, which dissuades consumers from doing the right thing. And that just has to stop. So it's not about putting good news out, it's about actually putting balanced information into the marketplace, and that's one of the key initiatives that we've taken on this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's over to you. If you could raise your hand if you've got a question, and if you could let us know to whom you want in the first place to address the question, and we start with Gina Miller. Hang on, microphone coming round.
A question for Keith. Keith, in the new numbers, have you noticed any different sort of diversity in the new people coming into the sector or the new IFAs, in any profile differences from the old guard, as it were?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of interesting numbers that are coming through. We're seeing a growing trend towards level 6. So for those that are in the sector, we're just under 4,000 chartered financial planners now. And actually the number of females that are going on to level 6 are increasing in compared to their male counterparts. Of the new entrants coming in, the graduates are far keener to go straight on through to level 6. So we're seeing a different sort of breed come in, as you would probably expect. But it's fair to say, rather than distort those numbers, the majority that have come back in, or the increase in numbers, is largely due to those that have come back into the market. In other words, they, for whatever reason, they were either practicing principals who decided to deauthorize themselves at the end of last year, have requalified and now come back in. So I would say the large percentage of those that have come in, which actually counters again the negativity of seeing some 30% exit the market. It's very difficult to get an accurate figure, but we believe that somewhere between 10 to 12% is the actual number that have exited the market, because the vast majority actually stayed within, turning their attention to other activities like business, managing the business, or non-investment mortgage and protection, which of course has taken a bit of a boom since the start of this year.
Can I just, I'd like to just comment on the numbers, because I think it is there may be a slight misleading impression. While the numbers have come up since the start of the year, they did fall from 2011. I mean, the FCA numbers, this is the numbers we've collected from them, they do two types of number. One is those with investment advice permission, which includes everyone who is qualified in that category, and they also produce numbers on financial advisors in what they class as financial advice firms. And for the latter, 2011, there was about 26,000. That's now about 21,000. For the former, it's gone from about 40,000 to high 30,000s. The numbers are vaguer there, as Keith says. High 30,000s to about 31,000. So there has been a comeback, but the original numbers we need to recognise have fallen. I think that has been one of the principal consequences of RDR. I'm not saying that we should row back, but I think it's incumbent on the FCA to think about the ease of doing business with the regulator to make it easier for firms to carry on and make sure that that those who are left in the market can continue to grow and recruit and develop.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Stuart Lee Davis, Redmayne Bentley. Question for Tim May. Tim, you mentioned in your piece that I think it was a consultation paper you were reading regarding fund management, which didn't read across to the firms that you're responsible for. Do you think we're ever going to get to a stage where we're going to see smarter regulation rather than more of it? It's a non sequitur to say that more regulation equals better client outcomes. And if so, do you think, how long do you think it'll take before we get to a position whereby, for all the panel members there, we'll have a regulatory regime which actually is bespoke enough that the firms that you all regulate can actually use it effectively rather than this one-size-fits-all approach that we seem to have at the moment? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The first point on specific regulation, I don't actually know whether we'll ever achieve it, to be blunt. I don't give up trying, and nor do my staff, but there are welcome signs. Two things. One is the development that Keith mentioned of the wealth management and private banking sector, or SAR, in supervision, but let's be fair, that's not policy. And so they have been quite clear to make the message that they do not cover policy. So they will assist from a supervision point of view. You could say that probably is quite sensible in one sense, since most of our policy comes from the EU now for the wealth management firms. But we will keep trying. I think the second point is the new approach, which has been mentioned by some of the other speakers of FCA. They are definitely more outgoing. They are trying very hard to actually come out and talk to people a lot more than I would believe FSA did in the retail space. So I welcome that, and I think it's very positive. But I think it will take a lot of time before we actually get what I would call very specific aspects of policy. But we won't stop trying. So we will keep on about that. As to the point about a regulator which helps, I think that's probably more likely, because I think there is more attempt, with the fact that FCA are being more outgoing, to actually talk about specific situations. So we are finding when we do raise points on behalf of firms who, sadly I have to say, still don't want to often go direct to the regulator, we are actually starting to create meetings between the regulator and the firm. I wouldn't say with us there as a referee, but they're starting to happen, as I used to know maybe 10 years ago, where we would have more positive discussion. So not with any accusations, not with any thought process the regulator's going to come running back in there to the firm, but actually to discuss a genuine situation that needs thinking about. Now, we've had a number of those since April when the FCA started, and we think they're actually starting to use those to actually filter some of their thinking as they move forward. So there are some positive bits on a regulator that works more and helps, but I don't know that we're going to end up with specific regulation, particularly from the EU.
Thank you. Any other panel members want to comment on that?
Yeah, on a similar sort of basis, some of our members now do fall under the wealth management and private banking, which was a bit of a shock. So, but that again, as Tim says, very much that's for supervision. On the policy side, we were hugely encouraged to see the asset management sector. We were working well with them. The downside to that is it's now joined with investment banking, which I think is a little bit of a backward step, and that is quite a shame. However, on the other side, and I can only endorse really what Tim said, we find now the regulator will contact the trade association. Can I just run something past you? Is this an industry norm? Do you know? It means then we can go ask a number of firms, pull it back then and say to the regulator, actually, yes, pretty much, or no, it's not, rather than doing a thematic on a small handful of firms and deciding that's the way that the industry does something and putting out either a Dear CO or some sort of consultation. So there's good and bad bits, and I suppose actually not just to pick on FCA. Also, we found now Treasury have really sort of pulled themselves up again, realised that they need to get out there and promote the UK, and we've seen a huge amount more than that. And you start to see now some of the other regulators from other sort of jurisdictions coming in and talking to the UK about how we do things.
I'd endorse what my colleagues have said. I'd also think I'd just comment that I think it's important that the FCA holds its nerve. It's talking about doing a lot of things that we find are quite encouraging. It's engaging, it's talk about data, it's having a hard look at what it collects from firms and whether it can do it better elsewhere. It's talking more about actually generating value for money for firms and looking at making sure that it looks at controlling its fees on a sort of 2-3 year basis. But what I hope it doesn't do is get knocked off course if, for example, another PPI comes along and it gets a good kicking in the press, etc., and then it retreats into its shell and thinks it has to hide behind a wall of rules. So I think it is important that it does stick to its current course, and hopefully, I don't think regulation will ever be perfect, but hopefully it can be better.
I mean, I'd echo the words that have been said, but I don't think the FCA will be blown off course. I think there are some genuine consumer issues that are driving the agenda, both in central government and at Canary Wharf, that recognise that a different approach is required. So I don't think this is a new regulator that's just come in and decided to be different. I think they are far more pragmatic, and they recognise there are some key consumer issues. And after all, a regulator is there to protect the interests of the public. Actually, having regulation that impacts negatively on the public is not a good thing, and it's not a good thing from a government perspective either. I would just sort of finally say, I think from an industry perspective, we have got to start to join up and demonstrate high degrees of professionalism. Nick mentioned culture earlier, and some of the language that is used amongst the industry in general is counter to professionalism. We have different views, we have different objectives, and we are very keen and eager to share them quite freely in public space. In this day and age with technology, consumers get onto trade websites, to blogs, to news sites, and there has to be a point where actually we collectively, through trade associations, professional bodies, need to start to collectively work together to change that culture that's in the market. The regulator comes out citing a concern, it's the rest of the industry that causes all the negative noise and damage. And we just got to kind of step back and start to work a bit more collaboratively in a more professional way.
Keith Phillips, do you want to make a comment? Yeah. Anyone?
I mean, I would echo everything that that the rest of the panelists here have mentioned. I was talking to our policy directors, and the view that they have with the FCA is far greater connectivity, greater knowledge sharing, general collaboration. We're doing considerably more with the FCA than I think we've done in the past. I do think it's incumbent upon the trade associations and the professional bodies themselves to join up their activities as well as representative, representing groups that are becoming more blurred in the way that the market is now operating. It isn't as siloed as it perhaps was a decade ago, and we, in question to the smarter point, I think the trade associations, the professional institutions, other key stakeholder groups themselves, need to come together more often and share views and collaborate more often. I agree with the point that's been made about the Treasury moving to set up the Financial Services Trade and Investment Board and the promotion of London as the global financial services centre internationally, and the expertise and the sort of the ecosystem that exists in London and the wider UK market, and the promotion of that internationally, I think is something that we as an industry also need to do. And we need to draw on the positive aspects of the legislation and the regulations that, whilst there is an enormous amount, and the BBA's just set up an office in Europe to sort of engage far more actively in the legislation that's coming from Brussels, I think we need to draw on those positive aspects. You know, London, stroke the UK, and our particular marketplace has a lot to say, both domestically and internationally, and we should be working smarter.
Thank you. Gavin, I'll come back over here in a sec.
Centre. It is, of course, an absolute truism that you need more regulation, but the amount of regulation you need is inversely proportional to the financial awareness of the population. So can I ask you about financial education? You are no doubt aware that financial education becomes compulsory in the curriculum as a result of decisions by government. What more can be done to support the introduction of financial education onto the curriculum? How is the money advice service doing? It's costing us something like 60, 70 million pounds a year. What more can be done to support BFEG, the Personal Finance Education Group? And in particular, really, what more can the trade associations do? It's only Susan Wright who's actually mentioned financial education on this panel so far. So what more can the trade associations do to support financial education for the population as a whole?
Thanks, Gavin. Who would like to start? Susan, you start, since you got 10 out of 10. Sorry, go ahead, Keith.
So we've already initiated something called Discover Fortunes, which actually goes into schools, universities, about financial education in schools. More importantly, it's training the teachers in that education process. We've also got a significant number of advisors who actually give up their spare time to actually use this principle to go into universities and schools. So we've got that as a national network in addition. So that's the very early stage of education. What we are doing is we're seeing a greater propensity to move up the professional standing ladder, is more firms start to independently engage at local level, and therefore that's helping to drive that education message. But I think it is an early journey. It was mentioned earlier, in fact, it was in the same hotel that we challenged one of the government ministers on, who was talking about financial education, yet in the same breath had made it much easier to get into debt, to borrow, than to save, and couldn't quite answer that off. So I think we've got a challenge that we've got to work with government as well to change some of the easy access or the culture that's been created over many years that actually drives that behaviour. An article just recently been written, we went back 30 years to try to actually work out why saving culture was so different. But actually, and there are a number of factors, but one of them actually was very simple. The man from the Pru, 13,000 advisors were still walking around the UK amongst others. But actually housewives generally managed the budget, wouldn't borrow. Their culture was to save even for short-term objectives, you know, the new three-piece suite. I mean, they wouldn't dare borrow to go on holiday. But that has dynamically changed over the past 2 decades, and that has equally had an impact. So youngsters don't necessarily see their parents demonstrating the right kind of financial behaviours because actually everyone just seems to borrow more freely. And with payday loans apparently recently quoting that they're not 5,800%, that's misunderstood, it's only 1% per day. You know, what chance have we got? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we are quite passionate at the IMA, and we do hugely support PFEG. And in fact, one of our directors is a trustee there. We sort of really want to get it out. And I suppose the concern really, I mean, actually, I would challenge anybody in this room who has children or nieces and nephews to say, you know, to say to them, well, what do I do? Because they don't understand it. It's, I mean, I know I have a daughter, and she's always something to do with money. You know, it's really difficult to sort of get the message out there. And I suppose the concern really with putting it through schools, although I think it's a great initiative, the worry is that it's like tick, oh well, that's that done, we've done, you know. And actually it should be much more sort of an integral part of school. And when you look at the different types of lessons they have now to what they had, I think it should be much more integral. I mean, they will face this every day, they will come across, you know, money, savings, retirement, all these sort of things, and that's the concern really, is that it may be a little bit, oh well, that's that dealt with. But yeah, I mean, there's the same sort of thing really, you know, that Keith has said. I mean, I think really all of us need to sort of get out there and whether it's, you know, volunteers or firms, there's so many opportunities. And I think we all have really good intentions. We know there's a knowledge gap. We know that actually those 20 and 30-year-olds, if they're not encouraged, they're not educated, then actually there will be a bit of a crisis in a few years' time. And, you know, and even as sort of those who are looking at sort of wealth managers and high net worth individuals thinking, well, that's okay, that's not us. Actually, it is ultimately underneath. There will be a sort of a bit of a feed through there. Sorry, that was a bit...
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would like to add something actually, because I think, and I'm sure that's why Gavin's raised it, more can always be done in this area. We must not underestimate how bad the educational aspect is, and certainly the change in the curriculum is a good start. Probably auto-enrolment is a good start. It will force people to have something they didn't have before, and they might ask some questions about what is it, what's it for. I have to say, under our new umbrella of Wealth Management Association, we are looking at two focus areas. One is actually the wider share ownership side, which links with the IPO work that I was mentioning, but that will need a fundamental push on the educational side. Probably across our firms first, dare I say, Gavin, in a sense, and with our link to the 4 million consumers, there's more we can do. We actually have never really worked directly on educational matters for consumers. That's not been a remit. But we do have a risk booklet, and interestingly enough, at a recent event that the Exchange put together for investors, 4,500 people were interested in taking that and giving quite interesting comments back. And it is just a basic risk booklet, but it taught us the lesson, how basic you have to get to. No one's actually answered MAS, but I will actually face up to it. It is an enormous amount of money goes to MAS, and all I would say is I think it's fantastic they're under new management. We have started to deal with the new management, and there are better noises coming out now, but with 60 million, it does sound an enormous amount of money, but then, as we're saying, there's a lot can be done, but at least they are now under new management.
Thank you. Yes.
As well, and I endorse what Tim has said, and we're talking to them about how they more effectively promote advice and advisors and connect their clients to becoming advisors' clients. But more as my main concern about them is their current strategy, relying on being totally web-based or predominantly web-based, because I think that by the time someone's clicked onto their website, or even before that, the person who's thinking about finding something out about financial advice are almost not the problem. We need to reach the people who aren't thinking about getting to the web, who are being passive, the people who, you know, the urban myth, well, it's not an urban myth, but the cliche of the person who puts their bank statements in the drawer without opening them and all that sort of things. It's the unengaged that are the problem.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Can I just add, as a member of the executive, we signed off at the BBA 3 core objectives for our focus as we move into 2014. One of those is promoting growth. One of those is helping customers. The third one is raising standards. And notwithstanding the work that we have across our policy committees, our advisory panels that focus on financial education and financial inclusion, and there's work going on all the time with the major retail banks, small retail banks, challengers, including private banks as well. I guess there's 2 key initiatives that we'll probably see more of as we go into 2014, so Q1 2014. One, we're reaching out and discussing with the Financial Skills Partnership what can be done at sort of apprenticeship level. And we think that's a piece of work that will connect some of the activities of the City of London Corporation, that will connect City Hall, through wider UK trade and investment activities on a regional basis, how we can reach out to the various promotional organisations across the country that represent cities and where there's a large banking presence that we can use as a trampoline to move into the local environment. So we're doing work with the FSP, Financial Skills Partnership. Another quite interesting initiative, which is I think we're going to see develop strongly over 2014, is the work that we're doing with the Young Bankers Association. This was an initiative that came out of the one of the top 5 retail banks in the UK. There's currently 1,800 young bankers, and their philosophy and their focus is sort of fundamentally different to how I was trained in banking just a couple of decades ago, and the philanthropy, the way that they reach out, the sort of societal impact is incredibly strong, and that's the piece of work that we're going to be working with the Young Bankers Association in terms of how they reach out to the local community, and that's something that will probably happen towards the end of Q1 next year, into Q2.
Thanks, Keith. We had a question over here, I think. Yep.
Richard Gray from EY. I heard three things this morning. One was a concern about the outcome for clients. Another was a concern about the cost of regulation. And third was Nick talking about the desire for competition. If you stand back, this is a highly profitable industry, both for firms and also for the people practicing it. Do the panel feel that the level of profitability can be actually justified by the providers, or would you expect to see margin compression over time?
Well, there's a tough one. Who'd like to start with that? Tim.
Firstly, I do think competition is a good thing, although having said that, and some of my previous experience working for infrastructure, you do have to be a little careful sometimes when competition comes in, because it actually can spread too thinly some of the opportunities that are out there. But in this particular industry, I think it is actually very positive, and it's shown by the fact that there are still clients coming to the firms and prepared to use those services. Now, we still have to probably make sure that as much as we can, what the consumer gets is the right thing and is totally transparent. So there's probably work still to be done there across both wealth management and asset managers. But largely speaking, there are certainly enough clients for the firms that exist. Now, that doesn't mean to say consolidation doesn't occur. In our particular sector, we've had quite a large number. 10% of our firms have actually merged or linked in with another firm in the last 18 months. So thus reducing our numbers. But interestingly enough, which is probably positive, there's as many new firms coming in, particularly boutiques, that are setting up, and not always in London, they're often across the rest of the country, that they are setting up services. So there is a demand for that competition. So I personally think it's good, but I just think we have to be a little careful to what extent some of those firms actually offer transparency always in what their offering is.
Thanks. Keith, yes?
I mean, there's no question about it. There's going to continue to be a squeeze on margin. Whether or not that's the right thing, I'm not sure. Part of the challenge that we have is an industry that's been around for a long time. It's been in a state of rapid evolution over the last 2 decades. And because of the margins that used to be made in the old days of the life companies, clearly a number have survived for a lot longer based on those legacy back books. I'm not entirely convinced that the consumer is as overly focused on cost as they are on value. And certainly trust is a big factor that we should be focused on. So I think the concern about constantly focusing on margin can be very detrimental in the long term to the public, and I think it's one that we need to tackle with the regulator rather than just concede. And that sort of runs in line that if you've constantly seeing an increase in cost to operate, an increase in cost of regulation, the risk that's associated with that at a time when actually commercial margins are being squeezed, then actually it doesn't take a genius to work out where that's potentially leading. So we do need to be very careful. The market has consolidated rapidly. I think we do need to work with the regulator to address any concerns they have on margin. But if it was right yesterday, we've got to be very careful that all of a sudden today it's wrong. It's actually how that better serves the end consumer. And we've got to be very careful not to keep driving in unintended consequences that come with changes to address one thing and actually have a very negative impact further down the pipe or somewhere else. So the cost of regulation is certainly a concern that we have. It's already having an impact on businesses and therefore ultimately on consumers. But I think the advice sector, interestingly enough, is in a slightly different place. While there's been a complete focus on the cost of advice, interestingly enough, advisors seem to have been evolving pretty well. They're in a state of evolution, and actually there's a greater degree of confidence where they're actually shifting to take pure fee, which actually came out in a recent report. The focus on the fund management or wealth management side now is an interesting shift of focus, but I hope it doesn't go to the extremes of impacting that particular sector to the point of decimation or consolidation to a point at which we lose competition in the market.
Just a couple of observations. Firstly, we've got transparency, one of the driving goals of RDR, which will put pressure on margins and pricing, although ironically Nick himself acknowledged that disclosure doesn't always have the impact that is intended by the regulator. The second thing we've clearly got is a regulator who has said that they will be following the money, where they see people piling up significant profits or what they consider supernormal profits, they will investigate and potentially take action. So I think you know there is clearly a path of travel there. I think it's also worthwhile bearing in mind that I think that, you know, there's through the chain there are other distinct markets that driven in different ways. At the fund level, where you know you've got advisors being the agent of the client choosing between things, and obviously value for money and performance is a prime consideration in making that choice. I think the market for the client relationship at the advisor level is very different, and there I think the integrity of the advisor, the professionalism, the quality of the service, and just the trust are the things that drive that relationship. A relationship with an advisor is not a commodity relationship that is purely driven by price.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, when there's sort of talk of sort of funds and sort of more traditional long-only asset management, many of the sort of firms' clients, in effect, are institutional. They're platforms, they're nominees, so slightly different. But as with sort of has been said so far, I don't think there's any harm in firms every so often re-looking at the costs. Are they appropriate? I mean, currently out there at the moment is all the issues on corporate access, which I'm not going to go into in this, but I mean, again, that's re-looking at, you know, that relationship with the sort of prime brokers. Is it right? Is it, you know, fair, appropriate, value for money, and all the other good stuff that's being paid for? You know, we're looking at sort of platform charges, so a real sort of look at sort of fees, but again, not so much at the margins, because it's like a lot of things, you won't, it's not free. It's no, you know, it's not a free service, but it's sort of building that whole thing and the trust. And I think there's so many things out there that you can't really pin it down, you know, to sort of one area. I think there's that whole sort of, you know, education, trust, transparency, and all of it coming together.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo everything that's...
Final thought to you.
I would echo everything that's been said. I mean, margin squeeze is real. And, you know, there are some positive aspects, lots of positive aspects that have come out as a consequence of the legislation. Obviously, the cost of compliance and the impact on that for the marketplace is material. I think we have to work with the marketplace to continue to innovate and to bring through, you know, sort of the new processes and the new innovation that you know we're sort of famous for, and we need to do that within the confines of the legislation and the regulatory environment that we work in. Certainly in the retail marketplace, within the challenger banking environment, we see new entrants coming on board, and we will see more of those coming into the marketplace in 2014. So, you know, competition's buoyant, and we would endorse that.
Keith? I think I'd just finally say, one of the things that Nick pointed out was culture, and you know, in the advice sector, it's often been referred to as the mum test. And that just is to provoke someone to step back and think, if someone else had given this advice to my mum, would I think that was fit for purpose? If I manufacture a product, do I think the charges that are being taken from it would be fair if that was sold to my family, to my mum? And I think culturally, it's as simple as that. If you can demonstrate that you've always got the best interests of the client at heart on those principles, then I think we'll have a much stronger and more positive relationship with the regulator, because it's very clear that that's what they're telling us, is where they see evidence, where clearly charges are disproportionate, activities or advice has been influenced by financial gain rather than the client's needs, then actually it's going to fail every time. So it might be a very simple analogy, but the mum test is one that should help provoke everyone to think, is what I'm doing what I would like to be sold or given to my family?
Ladies and gentlemen, Tim May, Keith Phillips, Susan Wright, Chris Hannett and Keith Richards, thank you very much indeed. Thanks. Thank you. Right, ComPeer Limited. ComPeer has built its business around benchmarking and research in the wealth management industry. They have always had the reputation for being one step ahead of the game. In organising this event today and undertaking the research which is central to it, they have once again proven their credentials. James Brown is a senior analyst at ComPeer. He will present the research output and analysis. And we're not going to take questions immediately after James because we'll have the coffee break. Then Simon Yu is going to give some aspects of it, and then we'll bring the two of them together to answer questions. But could you show your appreciation for James Brown?
Good morning, everyone. As the title of our conference suggests, we were very keen to understand what the clients think in a year of major changes in the wealth management and advisory sectors. Regulation is essentially in place to protect the client, but few have actually asked them how they believe they need to be supported and protected, or if they are in fact happy with how things are. Working with our research partner EY, we took on this task via an in-depth online questionnaire which was completed by 1,000 investors. So to give you some background to the industry, the sector has recently reached £600 billion of assets under management and administration, and it continues to expand. It delivered record years in 2011 and 2012 in terms of profits and revenues, and the industry is therefore in good health, with minimal indication of significant withdrawals from disgruntled clients. Yet, it is one of the most regulated industries, with much more in the pipeline. Is this level of regulation therefore necessary, and should firms be spending 10% of their revenues or 50% of their profits on compliance matters as they currently are? So on to the interviews. The investors we spoke to ranged from mass affluent to high net worth, all currently receiving a range of advisory, discretionary and execution-only services. In this presentation, I will outline the key findings from the research, starting with a few slides providing an overview of current investor attitudes and what makes them use a wealth manager and stay with them. And then I'll move on to the hot topic of regulation, and I'll be answering, among others, how regulation is impacting the clients, do the rule changes match their needs and desires, and what role do the clients actually want the regulator to play. I'll then finish with future expectations of the clients and their opinions of the sector. So let's start with persuading clients to invest more of their cash in investment products, with the top two answers provided here. Across all three wealth bands, more than half of investors said they would invest more if they were either guaranteed protection or a return on capital, therefore highlighting a cautious approach to their investments, which is possible a reaction to uncertain markets in recent years. When reviewing by the different wealth bands, more than 50% of high net worth investors would also be persuaded to invest more in investment products if the low yields on cash continue and if equity markets were to strengthen. Perhaps these investors are more optimistic of the future movements in equities and are open to taking on the risks involved. Evidence of the differing attitudes towards risk come when asked whether risk is a necessity to make money and if investors are willing to make a loss if it leads to greater long-term gains. In both cases, the wealthier the investor, the more likely they are to agree, and so the more open they are to taking on the higher risk investments. With a larger portfolio to fall back on, it is understandable that high net worth individuals would be more adventurous. Whereas mass affluent investors may require further caution in case they need to take additional withdrawals on the back of changing life circumstances, thereby reducing the potential term of their investments. Although appreciating the need for some risk, this is not to say investors have a gung-ho attitude to their investing. For example, half of them suggested they are still worried about the volatility in the market, and with an example quote provided here by one such investor who believes he'll be unable to recover from losses sustained during the market crash. Moving on to the client's view when selecting and staying with a wealth manager or advisor. It is clear how important investment performance is to them, being by far the most frequently chosen main factor for both. And when we conducted a similar piece of research in early 2012, the results were the same, with investment performance topping the rankings. And something interesting which came out of that survey was that there were contrasting views from the wealth managers who actually thought that relationship and fees were more important to the client. As another indication of the importance of performance, it also topped the tables when ranking elements in terms of how much value they add to the client when considering the charges that they pay. It is therefore time for wealth managers and advisors to take note that clients are expecting them to deliver a good return if they are to keep their business. The key difference between factors for staying with a wealth manager and choosing one is the importance of relationships. Across all wealth bands, at least 5% of additional investors ranked relationships as the number one reason for staying with a wealth manager in comparison to choosing one. The relationship is especially important among the high net worth individuals who are more likely to have a one-to-one personal service given the magnitude of their investment. Interestingly, although fees are playing a key part in regulatory discussions, only 7% of investors stated this to be the main reason they would choose a wealth manager. Therefore, price sensitivity may not be as significant as one may expect. On to regulation now. And firstly, the question of what role do investors want the regulator to play? And here are a few example quotes. In line with earlier results, protection is a key theme through the prevention of missold products and through greater transparency, two key objectives from the Retail Distribution Review. Another recurring theme, as brought out in the first three quotes, was to single out the non-compliant firms, rather than taking a one-size-fits-all approach and effectively punishing all firms in the industry through increased costs and paperwork. Many investors are happy with the service they are currently receiving and so cannot see a reason why significant changes are required in order to now be compliant. Some investors also suggested there are too many loopholes for the non-compliant firms to get through. There is a desire for the regulator to be more proactive rather than reactive. For example, only 1 in 10 investors has had personal experience of the regulator protecting their interests, and in all cases this was already after a major incident had occurred, with many citing the Icelandic banking crisis. I by no means claim this to be an easy job, but from the views of the investors there appears definite room for improvement, with the same proportion of investors stating they were dissatisfied, and that was 22%, with the current level of regulation, as to those who were satisfied. The remainder were either neutral or did not know how to judge if they would be satisfied or not. I mentioned RDR, including some of the key objectives that investors are after from the regulator, but as this slide suggests, very few investors have actually heard of it, and so it's not surprising that they are unaware of the exact changes that are taking place. RDR is having the largest impact on the advisory sector, and so it could be thought that its implications would have been conveyed to clients to these firms. However, as the figures show, this is far from the reality, with only 26% of advisory investors having heard of it. Adding to the concern, for those investors who have heard of RDR, 30% were still completely unaware of its objectives. So there's a definite issue with communication, but should it be the responsibility of the regulator, the wealth managers or advisors, or the government to actually be speaking to these investors? Now, some will argue that it should be the wealth managers and the advisors that take the responsibility of explaining the changes to their clients. However, as this chart shows, there are insufficient levels of communication between a number of wealth managers and their clients. For example, 54% of all advisory investors and 55% of all discretionary investors have not met with their wealth manager in the first 10 months of 2013. And this is not to say the investors do not want to meet in person. For example, 47% stated they would like to meet with their wealth manager twice or more per year, but only 29% actually achieve this. Additionally, as I'll prove later, communication is one of the main areas where clients want to see improvements. Only a minority of investors have specifically heard of RDR, but that is by no means the only regulation that has come out since the credit crunch. The 1,000 investors were therefore asked if the combination of regulatory changes in the last 5 years have impacted the services they receive from their wealth manager or advisor. Albeit greater than the proportion citing negative impacts, only 17% of clients felt regulation has had a positive impact on them, with the bulk of these agreeing that costs are now more transparent and the quality of advice has improved. 72% felt there had been no impact or they were unsure of the impact made. This is therefore again because they have not had the regulatory changes explained to them in great enough detail. One of the well-publicised negative impacts for the wealth management and advisory sectors is the possible formation of an advice gap. With the added costs resulting from regulatory changes, some firms have deemed it impossible to provide advice to lower value clients and still remain profitable, and so have raised their minimum investment thresholds, or in fact withdrawn from the provided advice entirely. This has encouraged more investors to become self-directed to the benefit of the execution-only stockbroking sector, which today boasts £110 billion of assets under administration, approaching treble what it was at the end of 2008, when it was at £38 billion. When asked how likely clients are to invest without advice, 49% stated they are likely or very likely. And if I only look at those clients which are currently receiving advisory or discretionary services, the figure remains high at 39%. Now, to put this into context, there are 500 billion of assets currently under discretionary and advisory agreements in the wealth management industry. So these results suggest that clients representing 200 billion pounds of this are considering their options. Now, I'm not saying they're going to transfer all of their funds to the execution-only sector, but say it's only 10 or 20%, that's still 20 to 40 billion pounds, which could be adding to the growth of the execution-only industry in the next couple of years. What's interesting, though, is when reviewing by wealth band, the highest proportion likely to invest without advice was in fact the high net worth individuals, implying that the movement away from advice is not just a result of higher minimum investment thresholds, but it may be also because of the very strong propositions provided by the execution-only stockbrokers. For example, there is a massive amount of investment research available for free on their websites. You can open an account in as little as 5 minutes and be trading almost immediately. And also there's a wide range of tradable instruments out there. Adding to the disadvantages to the investors, 2/3 believe that the added costs of complying with new regulations will be passed on to them, which in some cases will make it unaffordable to receive advice. The new regulations may therefore be adding to the protection of the investors, but at the same time, it may be preventing some of them from receiving advice at all. With the charges likely to be passed on to the clients, this will most likely take the form of increased fees. In a reversal of what some may expect, it was high net worth individuals who most commonly stated their fees have increased in the last year, proving that the mass affluent are not the only segment to be affected. The majority believe their fees have not changed in the last year. This could be because of the time frame required to set up and launch a new fee structure across an existing client base, and so future fee increases could still be in the pipeline. Alternatively, are the charges actually visible for those who think the fees have not changed? Well, the good news is for 87%, the client believes their wealth manager is not hiding the true level of fees, highlighting successful implementation of at least one of the objectives of RDR. So how should the fee structures be set? In the last few years, we've witnessed a movement away from commissions and towards clean fee charging by wealth managers. These fees are most commonly charged as a percentage of assets and remains the most popular choice of charging structures for the investor. An interesting result is that when reviewing the option of charging a fixed fee or hourly charge, 11% of investors are currently paying this type of fee, but it has the most significant markup when asked how investors actually wish to be charged, almost doubling to 21%. Could this therefore be the way forward for charging for advice? As it stands, 43% of investors suggested they would rather be charged in a different way to as they are, thereby opening the door for firms wishing to make significant changes to their structures. Another area currently being developed by some wealth managers is the client reporting services, both online and paper-based. Here there are some contrasting results from the survey. Although only 10% of investors are dissatisfied with the reports they currently receive, 25% understand only some, little or none of the reports they are given. It therefore implies that some investors are satisfied with not understanding everything they read, which certainly surprised me. And although most are claiming to be satisfied with their reports, this is not to say they do not want them to be improved. In fact, client portals were the most commonly suggested area needing improvement, with 62% suggesting at least some improvement is required. Second on the list is an improvement in client communications and education, an area that needs to be addressed soon given the issues shown in earlier results. Clients want to be spoken to, and so that their opinions can be heard, as highlighted by 47% being open to receiving more formal surveys from their wealth manager or advisor. And these suggestions should not be glossed over, with 40% of those individuals citing at least one area of significant improvement, saying they will look for another wealth management provider if this problem is not addressed in the near future. So we've seen where clients want improvements, but do these in fact tie in with what they expect? The first figure I'd like to point out on this slide is that only 31% expect to receive more regular contact from their wealth advisor, despite all their wishes for more communication. I struggle to think how a wealth manager can build trust with a client if they do not meet this demand. With 87% agreeing with the top statement, it matches the want for the regulator to assist in preventing products being missold. And the final figure I'd like to point out is that 63% want direct contact with the person responsible for making the investment decisions rather than going through a relationship manager. It's possibly a form of maintaining some form of control and a greater understanding of where and how their money is invested. And moving on to the current opinions of wealth managers, and here are the proportion of investors agreeing with each of the statements. The key thing to draw out from these findings is that across all of the statements, a third or more of clients were unable to agree. So there is a significant minority who feel the investment products they receive are not always appropriate, their opinions are not being heard, the personnel responsible for their investments are not as capable as expected, and the sector is not delivering enough value for money. This is another sign that many clients are not currently reaping the rewards of the additional regulation, and many wealth managers need to up their game. Client centricity. This should be at the forefront of any wealth management service, and apparently, if you ask wealth managers themselves, as we did last year, they believe that is the case, that 100% said they are client-centric. However, as the results show, only 54% of clients would agree or strongly agree that their current wealth manager is client-centric, and the results are worse when reviewing the wealth management sector in general. The question could therefore be raised as to how a wealth manager can claim to be client-centric if they are not meeting with their clients at regular intervals. Maybe something our panel can answer later this afternoon. So to conclude, communication is a major concern for the firms and the regulator, as too many clients are unaware of changes. The advice gap is developing and may actually be wider than expected, with investors across all wealth bands now likely to invest without advice, with many expecting the increased costs of regulation to be passed on to them. A key role for the regulator is to come down harder on those non-compliant firms without punishing all of the firms in the industry. Client centricity and trust levels are not as high as they should be. And finally, investment performance is viewed as an extremely important factor if wealth managers and advisors want to win and retain their clients. Thank you all for your time this morning. Once we've heard from the comments from Simon of EY, our research partner, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, time for a break. Can I say two things? One is, would you please do us the courtesy of visiting our sponsors outside when you're having your coffee, and could you be back at 11:20? Thank you very much indeed.